many people actually left Egypt in the Exodus? We see movies and children's books depict a large number, but how many Israelites were actually there? Now, the Bible actually has a semi-clear answer that it gives us. If that is the case, it may surprise you that there is a large amount of debate over the actual number. Well, let's start with what the Bible tells us. Numbers 1 conveniently gives us a census of all of Israel's male warriors. This excludes women, children, and men that were not able to fight anymore. The end number given is 603,550. Now, it's important to note that this number is stated 3 different times. At the end of the census in Numbers 126, at the end of the camp arrangement in Numbers 232, and it is given a 3rd time in Exodus 38:26, which is referring to the census that was taken at the beginning of Numbers. Now, it is important to remember that it is recorded 3 separate times. We'll get into why later. So our number for the 12 tribes minus Levi is 603,550. The number of Levites, though, is recorded in chapter 3. The number of all the males over a month old was 22,000. That puts the number of recorded males around 625,000, which was recorded 1 year and 1 month after the Exodus. Based off of this number, they estimate that the amount of people who left Egypt were between 2 and 2.4 million people. That is a large number. They get this because they add on the women and the children. So that's your simple answer, about 2 or 2.5 million people. But as I said, there is a large amount of debate over this number because it presents a couple problems. First problem, it seems to go against the modern thoughts of the size of cultures back in that day. Most of the nations living in the land of Canaan were thought to be significantly smaller than 2 million. With Israel having that many people, especially 600,000 warriors, they would have easily been a world superpower in that day. Egypt at that time was thought to be a total population of between 3 and 4 million. Several centuries later, the great Persian Emperor Xerxes was estimated to have an army of only 200,000. The Assyrian army that wiped out all of Israel and most of Judah was thought to have about 150,000 warriors. With these numbers, 600,000 doesn't seem to make a whole lot of sense. There's also that Deuteronomy tells us that the nations living in Canaan are mightier and more numerous than Israel. This does not seem to make much sense with the modern thought that those nations would have been significantly smaller. Second problem. Exodus 23:29-30 says, "I will not drive them out from before you in 1 year, lest the land become desolate and the wild beasts multiply against you. Little by little I will drive them out from before you, until you have increased and possessed the land." If Israel was 2.5 million people, why is God concerned about the land overtaking them? Wouldn't that be more than enough people to inhabit the land? Third problem. During the census, God commanded Moses to count all the firstborn males a month and older. The total number listed is 22,273. By that number, with the 603,550, you get a ratio of 30:1. That means for every firstborn male, there are 30 other males born to the same family. That would then mean that each family would have an average of 60 children per family. This number seems unreasonably high. Based off of these problems, the modern thought of ancient nation size, and the way they interpret the census, they argue that the number of Israelites that left Egypt was about 22,000. They get this number in an attempt to reconcile these issues by doing what I will call language gymnastics with the Hebrew. We'll take Numbers 121 as our example, but they do this with all the numbers of the census. It says, those listed of the tribe of Reuben were 46,500. The Hebrew for the numbering goes, Shisha v'arba'im elef v'chamesh meot. 640,500. Put that all together and you get 46,500. Now, to make this number smaller so that they can add up all the numbers of the census to equal 22,000, they argue that the word Elef here can mean tribe, clan, or family, and not thousand. It is true that the word Elef can be translated as tribe, clan, or family. We see this in the case of Numbers 1:16, Numbers 10:4, Joshua 22:14 and 21, Judges 6:15, and Micah 5:2. In all these cases, the Hebrew word Elef is translated as clan, tribe, or family, all referring to the same thing. So we do have biblical examples of this word being translated as clan instead of thousand. They then say that's what's being done here. It's not 46,000 people, but 46 clans. What about the 500 then? It was 46,500. Well, they say that the performative translated as and can also be translated as or. The whole sentence then means 46 clans or 500 people being implied. Do this through the entire census and you get a total of about 22,000 rather than 2 million. This seems to solve the issues listed, making Israel's army size only around 5,500, as well as its firstborn ratio a 1:4 instead of a 1:30. Does that settle it then? Is it 22,000 instead of 2 million? Actually, no. This ends up creating different problems. The most substantial problem is the final calculation, 603,550. This number just doesn't add up. Even if you try and say that it's 603 clans or 550, the number still just doesn't make sense. They then chalk this up to a scribal error, which does occur. But remember at the beginning, I told you to remember that the number 603,550 is recorded 3 separate times, which is across 2 different books. It seems unlikely to me that a scribal error would occur 3 times across 2 different books. So let's dissect their argument and then address the problems raised against the 603,000. They argue that the word Elef can mean clan, which then must be what's going on here. However, some scholars insist that the grammar of these phrases makes it impossible for Elef to be translated anything but thousand here. Let me explain. If we go to all the examples I listed above where Elef is translated as clan, tribe, and family, we notice a couple things. Note that I changed the translation so the word clan is used in all of these verses, just to make things a little bit easier. Numbers 1:16, the heads of the clans of Israel. Numbers 10:4, the heads of the clans of Israel. Joshua 22:14, they among the clans of Israel. Joshua 22:21, to the heads of the clans of Israel. Judges 6:15, behold, my clan is the weakest in Manasseh. Micah 5:2, among the clans of Judah. First thing in all of these, except Judges 6:15, is the word clan is used in construct. Basically what that is that you have the word of in there. The clans of Israel. The word is in a construct phrase. Context says that Judges 6:15 is speaking of the clan of Manasseh, even though the word isn't in construct. The other important thing that you may notice is that there's no numbers in these passages. That is extremely important. When we go back to our example verse in Numbers 1:21, it says, those listed of the tribe of Reuben were 46,500. Remember that the Hebrew numbering goes 6 and 40,000 and 500. There are numbers and then values attributed to that being 100 and 1,000. Within the phrase, it makes no sense to translate Elef as clan instead of 1,000 when you're translating Me'ot as 100. The phrase makes you translate it 46,000 and 500. The point of the performative translated as and being able to be translated as or also doesn't make any sense. It's not the natural way to read it, nor is it also the common way to make a clarification in the Torah. You'll see phrases like, Jacob came to Luz, that is Bethel. Or, of liquid myrrh 500 shekels, and of sweet-smelling cinnamon half as much, that is 250. If they were wanting to clarify that the 500 was the amount of men in the 46 clans, why wouldn't the author use a cleaner construction to say that? I argue that the author is not trying to say that, and he's giving the numbers as they are. Translating as clans also brings problems when the Bible recounts the number of people that died due to God's judgment on them. If Israel is 22,000 people, how can 24,000 people have died at Peor? That's more than their population. Or how about the 14,700 that died from the plague at Korah's rebellion? Their counter to this is to again translate those as clans, but that doesn't really entirely fix the issue. It's also not consistent when we look at passages like Numbers 31. Take verses 32 to 35. Now the plunder remaining of the spoil that the army took was 675,000 sheep, 72,000 cattle, 61,000 donkeys, and 32,000 persons in all, women who had not known a man by lying with him. You wouldn't translate this as 675 clans of sheep, which also wouldn't make sense with how the Hebrew is written. Why then would you count it as 32 clans of people instead of 32,000? It would make sense if it was 32,000 people and Israel was only 22,000, much less the entire amount of people added up in Numbers 31. 32 clans also doesn't make sense because it still outnumbers some of the tribes listed in Israel. My last issue that I'll go into with translating this as clans has to do with Deuteronomy 1:10. The Lord your God has multiplied you, and behold, you are today as numerous as the stars of heaven. 22,000 people hardly seems like the number of the stars in the heavens. Even with what we modernly think ancient people would have pictured that as, 22,000 still seems quite small. How is 22,000 God fulfilling his promise to Abraham that his descendants would be like the number of the stars in the heavens? I think that would be a pretty weak fulfillment of the promise, especially if they're arguing even in that day that Egypt was around 3 million. So then what about the problems listed for them being 2 million people? How do we reconcile those? The first problem was, it seems to go against the modernly thought size of ancient cultures. Well, simply, perhaps our modern thought on the ancient size of cultures is wrong. That there is a topic all on its own. Like I said, they think that Egypt was in total 3 to 4 million people. So they say, well, Israel couldn't have been 2.5 million because then Egypt wouldn't have been able to control them. I say the opposite. The large numbers prove that because of Exodus 1, 9, and 10, where Pharaoh speaks to Egypt and says, "Behold, the people of Israel are too many and too mighty for us. Come, let us deal shrewdly with them, lest they multiply, and if war breaks out, they join our enemies and fight against us and escape from the land." The Egyptians saw Israel's growing numbers as a threat, and that was the very reason why they enslaved them. The fact that as time went on that Israel became about 70% of their population shows that the Egyptians were right in their thought about Israel becoming more mighty than they. They tried to solve that problem by killing all the male babies. Well, what about Assyria and Persia only having armies of 150,000 or 200,000? How would have Assyria conquered Israel and much of Judah with only that amount? Well, the Assyrian army must have been bigger than 150,000, considering that God killed 185,000 of them outside of the walls of Jerusalem. So if these nations had more people than we modernly think they did, and their armies were larger than we modernly think they were, it solves that problem. The second was about God not letting them take the land in less than a year, lest the wild animals in the land consume them. Isn't 2 million people enough to populate the land? I honestly don't see this as a problem, because God in his infinite wisdom said it was to be this way. Who am I to question his guidance? He's the one who knows better. If he saw it as a problem, then there must have been a problem, even if they were 2.5 million people. The third is the hardest of them, the 1:30 firstborn ratio. It is extreme, I'll admit that, but let me try and make some sense of it. When the Bible speaks of the firstborn, which is generally in reference to the father, it is speaking of all of his children, though they may have different mothers. If a man has several wives and even concubines, he can have a great number of children, though only one is the firstborn. This is especially clear with the laws given in Deuteronomy 21, 15 to 17. I believe this is what is going on here. Men have multiple wives and even concubines, so they have many children. Remember how Pharaoh saw the Israelites becoming more numerous than they? Remember what he did around the time Moses was born? He had all the male babies killed. We're not told how long he did this, but we kind of get the sense that it was for an extended period of time. What happens when you kill all of the male babies and not the female ones? You have a generation with an abundance of females, but a lack of males. This was one of the oldest, if not the oldest generation that left Egypt in the Exodus. It would be no surprise with that situation in that culture for each man to have many wives. Many wives means many children born to one man. Is it enough to be a 1:30 ratio or an average of 60 children in total? It could be. That is the most reasonable explanation, which does make some sense. In the end though, I take the Bible at its word. If it says that there were 603,550 men of war that left Egypt, I believe that. If that means that it's 2 to 2.5 million Israelites that left Egypt in total, then that's how many did. If that then requires a 1:30 firstborn ratio, then that is what is true. I don't believe that we need to do some language gymnastics to fit our preconceived ideas, especially when what the Bible says does make rational sense. Is it possible that God only brought out 22,000 people? Maybe. It's unlikely. And I don't think so. People make the same argument about David's census when he counted 1.57 million fighting men in Israel and Judah. I believe that the Bible says around 600,000 people exited Egypt, which could mean around 2 million people total. But even if you do believe that God only brought out 22,000 people, it does not minimize the great work, the miracles that God did to free his people from slavery. Hope you enjoyed this video and hope that you got the answer that you came here to view. Give this video a like and subscribe to the channel. We recently hit 500 subscribers, so thank you all for your support and what we're doing here. That is all for today, so until next time, remember to know the word, do the word, and share the word, but as always, we do it in love.